Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. As you know, we are discussing executives and specifically cabinets because the cabinet represents the executive. And we've been distinguishing between parliamentary and presidential systems. The reason is because we're going to use the distinction to evaluate how different types of systems affect democracy and if they, for example, promote or inhibit accountability, be it vertical or horizontal, how they impact, say, representation, how they impact the balance of interests. So, today, what I have in mind is we will continue to sketch out and outline parliamentary systems, and we'll do so in a way that highlights the key differences between parliamentary systems and presidential ones. And then eventually, I've got some questions that I want to pose to you that we'll use to sort of discuss and evaluate these systems. And as always, the objective is to think about how these institutional choices impact democracy. Remember that as institution builders, we have choices, and institutions don't create themselves. Humans do. We in society create them. And so we then have a choice between different alternatives, and those different choices will have different consequences: political, economic, social. For us, the most important consequences are political and relate to democracy. So, as always, we're going to be keeping in mind that D word, democracy, thinking about how democracy is affected by these different issues. Let's get started then and be off. Remember that a parliamentary system is characterized by an executive that is selected by the parliamentary majority that emerges through the legislative election. And so, as a voter, you vote for a legislator or legislators, and the resulting legislative majority after the election anoints a prime minister. And they do so as part of the anointing of the cabinet itself. And so the entire executive is produced by the legislature. In the same sense, the legislature, as you know, also has the power to issue a vote of no confidence and therefore to withdraw its support of the executive. A lost note of a vote of no confidence, or a vote of no confidence that the executive loses, the legislature wins, can result in a new government without an election. In some cases, like, for example, Italy or Denmark, it can trigger a new election, as in Ireland. And in both of these cases, there is the replacement of the government. And so the point here is that the executive serves at the mercy of the legislature, and the legislature retains the power to remove the executive and to remove the entire cabinet should they issue a vote of no confidence. There is, of course, a distinction between a vote of no confidence and a constructive vote of no confidence. And a constructive vote of no confidence is a vote of no confidence that also includes a suggestion regarding an alternative government or who the new government should be. And so in Germany, for example, when you propose a confidence motion, you must also specify a government alternative. That is, who is going to replace the government falling as a result of this vote of no confidence. The point that I want to make to you is that if it's not clear already, parliamentary systems create executives and cabinets that are much weaker than presidential systems, where the executive and the cabinet really are directly elected by the voters. And really, the cabinet itself is a set of choices made by the elected president. And it's not even a decision made by voters or made by any elected official. And that means then that there are very different incentives. It means that there's potentially a lot more room for disagreement between the executive and the legislature, and especially if they come from different parties. And this is something that we'll discuss more as we go along. But In a parliamentary system, then, the government does consist of the prime minister and the cabinet, just as in a presidential system, the government consists of the president and the president's cabinet. The individual ministers in a parliamentary system have ministerial responsibility. They are responsible, liable for their department, be it transportation or finance or education or whatever. But the key difference between a presidential system and a parliamentary system is that in a parliamentary system, the individual ministers are bound by collective cabinet responsibility. What that means is they are collegial and co-equal. The different ministers are co-equal to each other as well as co-equal to the prime minister. The prime minister is actually no different than the other ministers. It's just that the prime minister is technically the executive, but they all share decision-making authority or decision-making power within that cabinet. It's a collegial or co-equal body, whereas in a presidential system is very different. The president picks the ministers who then play more of an advisory role to the president and whose consent is not necessarily required to advance a legislative proposal out of the cabinet and into the legislature. In this government, which consists of the cabinet and the prime minister, it needs the confidence of the legislature in this parliamentary system. Whereas in that presidential system, it does not need that confidence. It survives independently, as we've said. So what this means is that in a parliamentary system, we don't vote directly for the executive. We vote for the legislature, and then the legislature chooses the executive. And the choice of executive involves choosing both the prime minister and the individual ministers. But you might be sitting there and thinking, but that still leaves open the possibility, for instance, that the prime minister's party has a party majority or a single party majority, and they alone anoint that prime minister and they alone decide who is in that cabinet. Touche. That would be a good point. It is always possible that a single party controls the legislature and therefore holds all the cards when it comes to choosing the prime minister and choosing the cabinet. And indeed, in those situations, there's virtually no proportionality in the cabinet. That is to say that the cabinet is almost always filled with partisan ministers, members of that party. And in this situation, we would have what we call a powerful executive. The parliamentary system in this case includes a prime minister and a cabinet who are quite powerful, given that they represent a single party and that they enjoy the support of a legislative majority that is entirely made up of their party members. That is a powerful executive. But there's also another possibility, and that possibility is that the party of the prime minister does not hold a majority, and it becomes necessary to form a coalition. In this situation, governance becomes much more complex because you have multiple parties, perhaps many parties. As you'll see in a moment, it could be as many as 7 or 8 parties who form a coalition whose support is necessary for the prime minister and the cabinet to survive. In this case, there's a lot of negotiating, a lot of bargaining that goes into the decision, and the anointing of a prime minister and a cabinet can take a lot of time. This first scenario, though, is what we would refer to as a single party majority government, where a single party forms the legislative majority and then enjoys the power to choose a prime minister and a set of cabinet ministers from their party. The second scenario is the scenario of multi-party coalition government. And this is where things get more interesting, because here you have a variety of different parties who may have very different constituencies and different ideologies, different programs, different histories, different relationships, who need to come together and form a coalition that can support and uphold a government. So where a single party majority doesn't exist, the party leaders come together and bargain to form a coalition that includes enough parties to command a legislative majority. And so this is a game of really a game of cat and mouse. It's a game of horse trading. It's a game of trying to shape the interests of different party leaders, exchanging votes, exchanging favors. Oftentimes it means banking support and then calling up that support later after supporting another party earlier on. It's about exchange and horse trading, and this is the stuff of politics. When they're engaging in this horse trading, parties and politicians and parliamentary systems have two goals that they consider. They have office goals, which relate to, of course, their political power and the control over their political destiny that they have. And they also have policy goals that relate to their substantive priorities, what they want to accomplish. You know, do they prioritize environmental protection? Do they prioritize um, the fossil fuel industry? You know, what is it that they prioritize and that they have identified as a policy goal? If it's a European government and a right-wing government, maybe they've identified immigration as a policy goal, and so on and so forth. But in all circumstances, the most likely coalition is what we call a connected minimal winning coalition. A minimal winning coalition is a coalition that only includes as many votes as are necessary to pass a legislative agenda. And so if you have an assembly that consists of 100 members, you would need a coalition that consists of 51 members or 51 seats or 51 votes. Fairly straightforward. The connected part relates to the ideological positions held by the parties within the coalition. And so if you have a connected minimal winning coalition, it means that you have multiple parties whom together just cross the threshold for legislative approval and who individually hold contiguous ideological positions. That means they hold ideological positions that sit side by side with one another. It doesn't mean that they hold the same positions. It just means that they fall essentially side by side along a spectrum. And so you might have a right party, a center right party, maybe you have a leftist party and a center left party, something like that. Contiguous positions. It means that they hold positions that sit side by side and that they're ideologically connected. A minimal winning coalition then is one that is relatively ideologically coherent, and one that is just large enough to ensure legislative approval and no bigger. But there are also some other possible coalitions, and these include minority governments, where the legislative coalition or the legislative bloc doesn't actually form a majority, it forms a minority, and a surplus majority government, which is a majority coalition, but that includes additional parties or additional members. These are less likely and in some cases quite rare, but there are some explanations for why some of these might exist. And so in a parliamentary system, when you get a minority government where a minority legislative bloc anoints the prime minister and selects the cabinet, there's sometimes a good reason for this, and it often has to do with how strong the parliamentary committees are. Remember that when we set up a legislature, we give a variety of powers to that legislature, and we can give those powers to varying degrees. Some legislatures are more powerful than others. It's the same with committees. The strength of parliamentary committees can vary considerably. When you have very, very strong committees in a system, it makes it more likely that minority governments might exist. And the reason is because when you have a powerful committee system, the opposition can gain substantial influence through the committees themselves, and they can use the committees themselves to exert influence. And they might actually perceive themselves to be better off trying to influence policy from positions within the legislature and within the committees than within the government itself. This is one circumstance where minority governments become more likely. And this is interesting because this then gets to that question of the balance of power and the relative strengths of the parliament versus the executive. And when the legislature itself contains mechanisms or contains committees that can be powerful counterbalancing forces in that relationship with the executive. Another possibility and another reason that minority governments often come up, excuse me, relates to the form of interest group relations. In a lot of European countries, they have what we refer to as corporatist interest group relations, where large centralized unions and large centralized employers associations are brought into formal bargaining arrangements where they cooperate to set wages combined with the involvement of the government. And this is a corporatist arrangement because of how centralized and organized the process of wage setting is. One reason that minority governments sometimes exist is because these corporatist interest group arrangements can also create positions of substantial influence within the political system that really lie outside of the executive or lie outside of the government. And so in some cases where you have corporatist interest group relations that have a formal role for centralized labor and employer associations, you'll get minority governments because it's possible to influence policymaking and influence the government almost as effectively from within the confines of those corporatist arrangements than from within the government. And of course, in the United States, we're more familiar with pluralist arrangements where these relationships occur really more in the political marketplace, so to speak, and outside of formal policy making. In these situations, there aren't formal channels for the involvement of these actors. And as a result, they don't have the kind of foothold or the kind of leverage or influence within the process that they would have in a corporatist situation. And so in a pluralist environment, minority governments are much less likely because they're just less institutionalized and there aren't pre-existing sources of power that can be exercised outside of the government. So in terms of parliamentary systems, you can think about a variety of different types. And this figure is giving us the proportion or the proportion, funny, of governments of different cabinet types between 1945 and 1990. And as you can see, the single largest proportion is the minimal winning coalition. That is the coalition that just barely crosses the threshold and doesn't obtain a single vote beyond what it needs to ensure legislative approval. Almost 30% or 92 cases in the data set match this type. The second most common type is the single party minority, and that's about 25% or 77 cases. The third most common type is the surplus majority. The fourth most common type is the single party majority, and then the fifth most common type is the minority coalition. And this gives you then a good sense of just how common different types are. So in a parliamentary system, we've already established that the difference between a presidential system is that the parliamentary system forms the government through the negotiation that takes place after the legislative election. You don't directly vote for the executive. But what that means then is that that process of negotiation and government formation that takes place after the legislative election can go on and on and on and can become quite complicated. Parties have to bargain over policy and over office. They've got to hash it out. They've got to work through their differences. And oftentimes, these differences can be extremely profound, and there could be all sorts of political consequences. Sometimes voters will withdraw their support from a party if that party cooperates too much with a party that's viewed as a rival party, for example. And so the process of negotiating the formation of the government is fraught with difficulties. There are political and there are policy and office considerations. It can take a very, very long time for a government to form. And you might be asking, well, how long? Well, from our perspective, the idea that it would take a long time at all seems incredible, doesn't it? And in fact, if you remember, I think that do you remember when the cabinet, the Donald Trump administration, the cabinet basically stopped taking orders from Donald Trump after the January 6th insurrection? And basically, Nancy Pelosi became the de facto executive, essentially. And that went on for like a few days. And there were a lot of discussions about how tenuous and unsafe that situation was because we effectively did not have a government, right? There was, in effect, at least a sort of breakdown in the normal constitutional channels. The reason I'm highlighting this is because I want you to remember that that was really only a period of a few days, just a period of a few days. Consider now that in a parliamentary system, it can take as long as 2 years or more to form a government. Now, the longest is, I think, 650 days, and that's in Belgium, and I'll show you that in a moment. But it's incredible to think about how much parliamentary systems can vary from presidential systems in terms of the government formation process and just how long and complicated that can be and what consequences that might carry for politics and for governance. And so at least in Western Europe, the average is 31.8 days. On average, in Western European parliamentary democracies, it takes about 32 days to form a government. And that means that, well, there's usually at least a month or so after the election and the formation of the legislative majority or the beginning of the negotiation process in the eventual anointing of that cabinet, inclusive of the prime minister. Now, the longest delay in forming a government used to be 208 days, but more recently, the Netherlands was outflanked by Belgium, which holds the record today. 541 days to form a government, 644 days without a government. It takes about 85.7 days on average to form the Dutch government. In all these cases, you might ask the same question, which is, at what point does that become unsafe? Do you need, and maybe we're being hyperbolic, and we'll watch a video in a moment that puts it in perspective, but this should be a shock to our conscience. This is strange stuff. The idea that you would be without a government for this long, especially when the parliamentary system in the first place puts such an important emphasis on the legislative agenda of the prime minister and the prime minister's cabinet. These numbers are striking, and in the Belgian case is especially striking because of the process and what took place recently. In 2020, Belgian politics saw its most recent long delay, and I think it was only recently that they finally brought to an end a period of almost 700 days without a government after the most recent elections. And we'll watch a video here in a moment that puts this in perspective. Efren asks, if government formation is delayed, how does it affect the constituents and public services? So my sense is that it doesn't affect those things. Let's watch a video though and get a sense of how it might or might not affect those considerations.
Welcome to Belgium, a country that has had no functioning government since December 2018. And elections last summer failed to turn around a working coalition. This country of just over 11 million people is made up of two language communities, the Flemish and the French, plus a German-speaking minority in the east of the country, and the political system is deeply divided and deeply complex.
Belgium is one of the only federal countries without federal political parties. So there's two of each. There's two liberal parties, two socialist parties, etc. So that, of course, contributes to party fragmentation, which means you need much more parties to form a government.
Add to this, Wallonia voted left, opting for the Green Party and the Socialist Party, and Flanders voted more right, opting for the Centrist Party and the Far Right Party. And on top of that, the two main political groups trying to form a coalition, well, they don't even get on.
The two largest parties, they've portrayed the other party as the big enemy. And of course, that makes it difficult now to try and form a coalition.
That said, daily life continues. Trains run, rubbish gets collected, wages get paid. The concern is the long-term issues that are being put on the long finger for now.
The budgetary situation in Belgium is already very problematic today. So if nothing is done about that, this will run totally out of hand. Also, a number of other important issues that have been put forward by all the parties in the election campaign, like the climate, like mobility problems, which is really a very big problem in Belgium.
For all these reasons, debates about splitting the country often pop up here in Belgium, and political parties in Flanders, like the N-VA, have the end of Belgium written into their manifesto, and it's something that many in Flanders wouldn't mind seeing. That said, there's zero appetite for a split in Wallonia, leaving Belgian frites, Belgian waffles, the Belgian king, the Belgian football team, and of course, the international capital of Brussels, keeping the country glued together for now.
So there you have it, the two largest parties, they don't even get on. But this is the Belgian situation where because of cultural and social and religious and linguistic fragmentation, there's a great deal of party system fragmentation. And despite having a federal distribution of power, they don't really have national parties. They have parties that kind of break down by those cleavages that I just mentioned. So they have two socialist parties, two liberal parties, etc., corresponding to the North and the South. And as a result, it's often very, very difficult to form those coalitions. And in this case, they were only able to eventually form that government when a 7-party coalition came together. So that's right, 7 parties. The coalition, the legislative majority that eventually formed and that was eventually able to produce, or what I should say is, I should be clear, the coalition that eventually formed so as to form the government, the cabinet, included 7 parties. And so then the cabinet itself consisted of partisans from 7 parties. And the prime minister would be then in charge of a very diverse group, and that collegial body within the cabinet would be very difficult to hold together, most likely. Jeffrey says, since it does take a while to form a coalition, how long do they take for legislation to be passed? Remember that in a parliamentary system, typically, if a government forms and if there's a legislative majority that's providing its continual support to the government, it doesn't actually take a long time to pass legislation, because that's precisely why you form a legislative majority, because the expectation is that if that legislative majority does not support and approve the agenda of the prime minister and the cabinet, it is in effect withholding its support. And so that can often lead to the dissolution of the parliament and new elections if a prime minister and the cabinet are unable to govern effectively, or if there are those long delays in approving legislation. And so what's interesting is that presidential systems and parliamentary systems are often contrasted for these reasons. Governance in legislating in presidential systems is often viewed as very long and delayed and drawn out, precisely because they independently survive, and not supporting the legislative agenda of the executive does not impair the survival of the legislature in a presidential system. But in a parliamentary system, withholding support for the legislative agenda of the prime minister can impair the the survival of the legislature, because they don't survive independently. And so to answer Jeffrey's question, it actually doesn't tend to affect the length of time that it takes to approve legislation. The one exception in many cases is constitutional amendments, because for like Portugal, for example, even though the cabinet essentially can rely on support of the legislative majority to pass its legislative agenda, constitutional amendments require a larger majority, and so those can be rejected, and it doesn't affect the survival of the government. But if it's the basic legislative agenda of the government that it was elected on, or that the legislative agenda of the majority that it was elected on, it can implicate the two. The question of how long governments survive in parliamentary systems is also relevant, because remember that at least in presidential systems, there is a lot of continuity, and unless the president is impeached or removed by the legislature, which may or may not be a power enjoyed by the legislature, that president will serve their full term, be it 2 or 4 or 6 years or whatever. And so there is a great deal of consistency and an orderliness to the expectations in a presidential system. In a parliamentary system, by contrast, because the survival of the executive depends on retaining the support of a legislative majority, and because the two don't survive independently, they can fall at any time. And this can happen, as I said, through a vote of no confidence or a loss of legislative support. And so let's take a look at some data that puts this in perspective. Yes, Michael, snap elections are a factor in certain parliamentary systems. And the prime minister can dissolve the legislature or one or both houses of the legislature, depending upon how many houses it has, if the legislative support for that prime minister's agenda is not forthcoming. And so, for example, in Japan, the legislature does choose the prime minister just like they would in a parliamentary system, but the prime minister can also dissolve the House of Representatives in the Diet if, for example, the legislative support of that majority is not forthcoming, or if for some reason there's been a change. And so yes, snap elections can be a factor. It's just that countries differ. Not every country is the same. The rules are always a little bit different everywhere. Let's look at some data, though, to get a sense of this. We can conceive of a change in cabinet or a change in government in the following ways. Any change in the set of parties that holds cabinet membership, and so in the partisan composition of the cabinet, any change in the identity of the prime minister, and so maybe the parties don't change, but the individuals change, and you get new ministers, and there's this sort of changing of the guard, or a shuffling, so to speak, or any general election, which could also and would ordinarily also result in a new government through a legislative election that would result in a coalition that would form after the election. These are all different changes that could be reflected in the cabinet, and we'll use them then using parliamentary democracy data to try to understand this. So when you take a look, you'll notice that governments survive to differing degrees based upon the type of government. And notice, first and foremost, that a single party majority is the most durable form of parliamentary government. If you have a single party majority, that single party majority is going to, like I said, pick a prime minister from their party, and then they're going to pick a set of ministers from their party as well. So there will be a very high correspondence, if not a complete correspondence, between the composition of the government and the composition of the legislative majority. And as a result, there's going to be much more cooperation, and it will be much more durable, that relationship between the legislature and the government. Consequently, unsurprisingly, in these cases, on average, the government lasts about 900 days. Like that's like, you know, almost 3 years. That's a long time. That's about like what we might anticipate. The governments that survive the longest are the ones that are built on a single party majority. Now you go down the list, you'll notice that winning a minimal winning coalition is the next most durable form of government. And this is in many cases going to be a two-party coalition. And those two parties are going to often, if not virtually always, be contiguous in their position. You know, maybe a right party and a right center party, or a left party and a left center party. But they don't survive as long. And it's because, well, you're going to have multiple parties in the coalition, and you're going to have multiple parties in the government. And so consequently, it's less durable because you're trying to carry out more negotiations and satisfy a wider, more diverse set of interests within the coalition. All the way at the other end, you find a minority coalition, and you discover that the governments that survive the shortest, or that don't last the longest, or last the shortest, or the for the shortest amount of time, I should say, sorry, can't talk today, are those minority coalitions. And you can understand why. A minority coalition could easily be outflanked by the majority, or the rest of the legislature, or the rest of the parliament, which could very easily displace the government, or carry out a vote of no confidence if that government doesn't pursue or make decisions that are satisfying to that majority. And so you can see then that there's a lot of variation, and it's understandable that some of these would last longer and some of these would be more vulnerable to collapse. But the thing that's interesting to note about this is that there's sort of a trade-off between presidential and parliamentary systems. In presidential systems, you get more durable governments that are in office for the duration of their mandate, right? The duration of a period of time that voters theoretically give to them when they elect them. In a parliamentary system, that government can be anointed and torn down on the same day. And it has to do with changes, political changes that take place in the environment, and that can take place, in society, or that can take place within parties. And as a result, governments are far less durable, and governments don't necessarily enjoy any fixed mandate. They are subject to legislative approval and legislative confidence. And moreover, if they don't retain the support that they need to pass their legislative agenda, they're often also better off dissolving the parliament and calling for a new election. And so very, very different systems. And what we're going to do now is we're going to begin to identify some of the key dimensions for differentiating between these. And we're going to highlight the key considerations for institution creation and how institutions work in these different systems. And the first consideration is the issue or the dimension of government formation. And what we've discovered is that executives in presidential systems pick their cabinets. We saw that Joe Biden picked his cabinet. Now, those cabinet picks are subject to Senate approval, but assuming he obtains that approval, no one is going to prevent him from composing his cabinet as he sees fit. Now, executives in parliamentary systems, on the other hand, do not. They do not pick their cabinets. They are themselves picked by the legislative majority, or the legislative constituency that forms the government after the conclusion of the legislative elections. That's a key difference. That means that presidents in presidential systems are much more powerful than prime ministers in parliamentary systems with regard to government formation, in regard to their influence over government formation. The second dimension relates to the survival in the governance of the government. And in this dimension, parliamentary cabinets need majority support both to survive and to legislate. Presidential cabinets, on the other hand, do not. Presidents do need legislative support to legislate, but their survival is not contingent upon retaining that legislative majority. It's just not. They survive independently. In this regard, presidents in presidential systems have a much easier time surviving and potentially governing than do prime ministers in parliamentary systems. That's an important distinction between executives in these types of systems, and it carries potentially important implications for democracy and how democracy functions. And then third and finally, there's the dimension of the concentration of power. Parliamentary cabinets consist of co-equal participants. Remember that I called them collegial bodies. The prime minister does not rule with just the advice of the other ministers. The prime minister essentially rules with the consent of the other ministers. It's difficult to rule without the support and the consent of the other ministers. It is a co-equal participatory body. It's sort of like a military junta that shares power in the sense that the different ministers enjoy a co-equal role in governing. And so, for instance, if the different ministers begin to disagree, that can cause the legislative majority to withdraw its support and to carry out a vote of no confidence, potentially to replace the government. Now, in a presidential system, by contrast, the president does not have to rule with the co-equal participation of his or her ministers. They only are there to advise and consent. They don't have a veto. The president is the one in whose hands power is concentrated. And so in this regard, presidents have much more power concentrated in their hands than do prime ministers in parliamentary systems. These three issues, these three dimensions, government formation, survival and governance, and concentration of power, help us to isolate on the key differences between these different types of systems. And I think the natural question for us becomes, given these considerations and these differences, what type of executive is more democratic? What type of institution or what set of institutions is more democratic than another? And what I want to do to begin to address these questions is I want to start with some polls that will kind of get your pulse and hopefully give you a chance to think about these issues before we step back in a moment and begin to address them with more of a discussion. Let's take this on and let me give you a poll that you can respond to as a way to participate in this. Let me go back to, so take a look then at these dimensions, and I want you to think about the differences and then answer this question. With regard to government formation, does presidentialism or parliamentarism represent the more democratic alternative? So I think the AP can call this one. There are still 5 votes out, but I'm sharing the results right now. And as you can see, it's a pretty decisive victory for parliamentarism. 28 of you, or 72% of those of you who voted, 39 of you voted total of 44, said that parliamentarism is the more democratic alternative. And 11 of you, or 28% of you, said presidentialism is. And, it's interesting. It's a good question because there clearly are some differences between these, right? You think about it, what they both have in common is that in both cases, the government is basically composed or created or set up by someone we elect, right? Under the parliamentary system, we vote for a legislator or legislators, in the resulting legislative majority after the election uh, forms the government, right? They pick the executive for us, the prime minister and the cabinet members. In a presidential system, we vote for both the legislature and the executive, and then the president that wins the presidential election picks the rest of the government, the rest of the cabinet. And so, in that sense, they're kind of similar, but they're obviously very different from the perspective of who it is who's selecting those cabinet ministers, right? In the parliamentary system, it's the legislative majority and the parties of the legislative majority who select those cabinet ministers as well as the prime minister. And in that regard, there's a much larger coalition or a much wider set of interests involved in composing the executive. In a presidential system, it's that presidential winner, the winner of that race, who chooses those cabinet ministers. And so in that regard, the decision-making process is concentrated in the hands of just a single person, whereas in a parliamentary system, it's that whole coalition who chooses. And I would imagine that those of you who said that parliamentarism is the more democratic alternative would refer to that difference, right? The fact that that legislative majority kind of theoretically is going to be maybe more representative of society as a whole, more so than that winner of the presidential election in a presidential system would be. And I would wonder though about the role of a single party majority. If a single party wins that legislative election, does that work against how democratic that government formation process is? For instance, if that coalition that forms includes 3 parties as opposed to 2, or 3 parties as opposed to 1, does that make the formation of the resulting government, does that make the process more democratic? Are there more and less democratic parliamentary circumstances under which those prime ministers are selected? It's an interesting question. I want to go to a new poll that takes on another question, a similar question. I'm going to stop sharing this and I'll go to poll 2. And I'm launching poll 2. And I'm asking you about the question of survival and governance. And I want to know, with regard to survival and governance, does presidentialism or parliamentarism represent the more democratic alternative? To answer your question, Michael, if we replaced the 17th Amendment process with direct election, yeah, that would make it more democratic, right? If popular election is part of our understanding or our definition of democracy, then totally. So this one's much closer. This one's much, much closer. Okay, I'm going to end the poll because it's just about been decided. It looks like 23 of you, or 58% of those who voted, said that parliamentarism has the more democratic alternative with regard to survival and governance. 17 of you said presidentialism, or 43% of you. And I think that you should be able to make arguments on both sides, right? You should be able to say, for instance, that, look, if you elect a president, or if you anoint a president or a prime minister or an executive, maybe they should be able to serve out a certain term, right? Or maybe they shouldn't be subject or vulnerable to removal. But maybe on the other hand, you might say that that parliament, if it is the embodiment of interests, and if it does represent interests, maybe it should have the power to remove the government, even if it means a new election, a new legislative election. There are different arguments that you could make, and we don't quite have time to address those today. But I think on Monday we will finish up this discussion, and we'll take on that last set of questions that I have here by having more of an open discussion. And I appreciate everyone's input today. I'm sorry that I can't give more attention to some of your responses. I'll see you on Monday, and I hope that you have a good weekend. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, Professor. See you next week.
You too, Max.